A bold CEO, a small-town mechanic, and a challenge no one believed could be won. This is not just the tale of a broken engine. It is a story of pride, of humility, and of the shocking twist that left an entire boardroom in silence. Now, let's begin. The boardroom gleamed under the afternoon sun, its glass walls overlooking the city skyline like a stage set for power. Every seat was filled with polished engineers in tailored suits, their notepads open, pens ready, though their attention was fixed on the drama unfolding at the head of the table. Vanessa Aldridge, the sharp-tongued CEO of Helix Dynamics, leaned back in her leather chair with a smirk that could cut sharper than any blade. Her words echoed through the silence like a dare. "Fix this engine, and I'll marry you." The room stilled for a heartbeat, then erupted with low laughter. The sarcasm in her tone was obvious, but the challenge carried a sting that hung heavy in the air. It wasn't just the absurdity of her statement, it was who she had directed it at. Across the table stood Deshaun Tillman, a small-town mechanic. In a gray shirt and worn jeans, his steel-toe boots marking faint scuffs on the glossy floor. He looked out of place among the polished marble, brushed steel, and the air of superiority. Yet his presence carried a calm weight that even the mockery couldn't shake. The engineers chuckled under their breath, trading looks of amusement as if they were all in on the same cruel joke. One leaned back with his arms crossed, whispering to the man beside him, "Good luck with that." Another muttered, "This will be embarrassing." To them, Deshaun was nothing but a sideshow, a desperate attempt by someone in the company to bring in outside help. But Deshaun didn't flinch. His deep voice rose steady and calm, cutting through the murmurs. "Ma'am, I didn't come here for jokes. I came here because I was told you had a problem nobody else could solve." The air shifted. His words weren't loud, yet they carried a quiet authority that made a few of the younger engineers glance up from their notes. It was the first crack in the wall of arrogance. Vanessa tilted her head, her smirk lingering, testing him. "So, you mean to tell me," she said slowly, each word dripping with disbelief, "that after 4 weeks of my best engineers working day and night, you're going to stroll in here from a garage on the south side and fix what they couldn't?" The challenge dangled like bait, waiting for him to stumble, to show weakness. But Deshaun's eyes stayed steady. "That's what I'm saying." His tone wasn't arrogant, wasn't defensive. It was simple, unshakable truth. The kind of tone that unsettled people used to control. Around the table, the smirks faltered for a moment. Silence pressed against the glass walls, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner and the faint clatter of Deshaun setting his toolbox on the floor. Behind him, the prototype engine sat mounted on its platform like a wounded beast. Wires dangled loose, panels scarred with burn marks from failed tests, its presence both impressive and pitiful. It was supposed to be Helix Dynamics' crown jewel, a revolutionary step in renewable energy, the machine that would place Vanessa and her company in history books. But after millions of dollars and months of frustration, it had become an embarrassment that refused to breathe life. And now, a mechanic, someone with no degree, no title, no prestige, stood between it and redemption. The laughter and arrogance in the room were easy shields for Vanessa's pride. But beneath her polished armor lay memories she buried long ago. She hadn't always sat in high-backed chairs or commanded rooms with a glance. She grew up in Mesa, Arizona, in a cramped house, where overdue bills stacked on the kitchen counter and her mother worked night shifts to keep the lights on. Her father, a math teacher with calloused hands, spent weekends bent over the hood of an aging station wagon, explaining each part as if it held secrets worth guarding. Vanessa had watched him, balancing on tiptoe to see better, nodding as if she understood even when she didn't. Those memories of grease-stained fingers and patient explanations lingered somewhere deep inside her, but ambition had taught her to lock them away. She had fought tooth and nail to rise through the ranks. While others slept, she studied. While others gave up, she stayed awake until dawn, reworking designs. By her mid-30s, she wasn't just climbing ladders, she was breaking rungs so no one else could follow. Helix Dynamics had been her battlefield and her empire, and she ruled it with sharpness that demanded respect, but often bred fear. In her world, weakness wasn't tolerated. Failure wasn't forgiven. That was why she had welcomed Deshawn into this room, not with hope, but with cruelty. She wanted his failure to be a spectacle, a reminder that not everyone was qualified to stand at her table. Yet, as Deshawn's calm voice lingered in the room, she felt something she hadn't expected. Curiosity. It crept in like an uninvited guest, unsettling her certainty. She brushed it aside, reminding herself of the theater she had staged. This was supposed to be her triumph, her moment to prove that Helix's problems weren't solvable by grease-stained hands. But sometimes, the very stage you build for someone's downfall becomes the stage for your own lesson. Around the table, the engineers leaned back, waiting for the inevitable humiliation. Vanessa's smirk sharpened, her pen tapping softly against the wood. She thought she knew the ending to this story already, but Deshawn, steady and unshaken, was about to show her, and everyone else, that not all victories belong to the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes they belong to the quietest man, the one who listens when everyone else is too busy laughing. The story of Deshawn Tillman did not begin in the glass towers of a corporate empire. It began in Kansas City, in a modest garage tucked between a row of weathered houses where the smell of gasoline clung to the air like a second skin. His grandfather had opened the shop decades earlier, a place where neighbors came not only to repair their cars but to sit, drink coffee, and swap stories while the old man worked. When Deshawn was just a boy, barely tall enough to peer over the hood of a car, he spent his days sweeping the floor, handing over wrenches, and listening to the rhythm of engines the way other children listen to bedtime stories. Every rattle, every hum, every cough of an engine became a language he learned long before school taught him letters. To him, machines weren't just parts bolted together. They were alive in their own way, and they never lied if you knew how to listen. By the time he was 12, he could diagnose problems faster than many of the mechanics who worked beside his father. He didn't rely on complicated diagrams or long equations. He relied on patience. He believed every machine had a story, and if you respected it, it would tell you what was wrong. That philosophy shaped him more than any classroom could. His teachers often complained that he spent too much time sketching carburetors and gear systems in his notebooks instead of math problems, but his father defended him. "Engines are his math," he would say. And he was right. The turning point came one summer afternoon when a frustrated customer rolled in with a sleek European car that none of the local shops could fix. The engine had died without warning, and even the dealership mechanics had given up after weeks of trying. Deshawn, barely 17 at the time, asked if he could take a look. With grease on his hands and quiet focus in his eyes, he listened to the faint sputter, traced the wiring like veins, and within an hour had the car roaring back to life. Word spread quickly through the city. The boy from the Tillman garage wasn't just good, he was extraordinary. Despite his growing reputation, Deshawn never sought fame or wealth. He worked the same long days in coveralls, treated every customer with respect, and never charged more than what was fair. To him, fixing an engine wasn't about money. It was about honor. Each repair was a promise kept, each restored car a life given back. He didn't chase corporate contracts or high-paying offers. He preferred the honesty of his small shop and the community it served. But fate has a way of pushing humble men into places they never expect. When Helix Dynamics reached out, it wasn't because they wanted him. It was because they were desperate. Their prototype had failed, their investors were restless, and whispers of collapse circled the company like vultures. Deshawn arrived at the headquarters in a faded pickup truck, parking it among sleek black sedans and imported cars that gleamed under the morning sun. He walked across polished marble floors with boots that carried dust from the Kansas roads, his toolbox in hand. The receptionist's eyes flicked downward at his clothes, the security guards exchanged skeptical glances, and even the junior engineers in the lobby smirked as though watching a farmer wander into a king's palace. Still, Deshawn stood steady. He did not bow his head or puff his chest. He moved through the gleaming hallways as if he belonged, not because he craved approval, but because his confidence had been carved from years of proving himself in silence. When the boardroom doors opened and laughter rippled at his appearance, he felt no sting of humiliation. He had heard worse. In every laugh he heard the same arrogance that had once told his father he would never keep a business afloat, the same doubt that had once told his grandfather a black man couldn't own a garage in Kansas City. Their legacy lived in him, and he carried it like armor. Vanessa Aldridge watched him closely from the head of the table. On the surface, she wore her usual smirk, her voice laced with sharpness, her pen tapping impatiently as though she were already certain of his failure. But beneath her polished exterior stirred something she couldn't quite silence. The sight of his dusty boots, the way he carried himself without apology, pulled at memories she tried to bury. She remembered her father leaning under the hood of their station wagon, calling her over to listen. "Hear that, Vanessa? That knock means the engine's talking to you. You just have to be patient." For years, she had told herself those moments were relics of a past she had outgrown. But watching Deshawn, it was as if those echoes had returned, louder than the laughter of her engineers. Her ego fought back, whispering that this man was beneath her, that his presence here was a mistake she would soon expose. But her curiosity dug in its heels, forcing her to lean forward just slightly to study the calm in his face, to wonder if perhaps he heard something in that broken engine the rest of them had ignored. It was a thought she didn't want to entertain, but it lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. And though she didn't know it yet, that shadow was about to change everything. The silence of the boardroom felt heavy as Deshawn walked toward the engine, his toolbox clinking softly with each step. All eyes followed him, a mix of skepticism and amusement flickering across polished faces. The prototype stood in the center of the room like a wounded giant, its panels scorched, wires hanging loose, bolts missing their homes. For weeks, the brightest engineers in the company had prodded and tested, each attempt ending in failure and frustration. To them, it was proof of the machine's complexity. To Deshawn, it was just another engine, another story waiting to be told. He set his box down and knelt, his calloused hands steady, his expression calm, as though the laughter and whispers around him didn't exist. The engineers wasted no time leaning into mockery. One smirked and muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Careful, he might try duct tape." Another chuckled, "Hope he brought magic dust with those rusty tools." Their voices bounced off the glass walls, feeding each other's arrogance. Vanessa herself leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her eyes sharp and glittering. "Don't take too long," she said coolly. "Some of us have real work to do." Her tone dripped with dismissal, but Deshawn didn't so much as glance up. He reached for a wrench, his movements unhurried, methodical, as if he were alone in his Kansas garage. Minutes passed in strained silence. Deshawn's fingers brushed over the wires like a doctor checking a pulse. He tugged gently at one connector and frowned. It slipped free too easily. "Loose," he murmured, not to anyone in particular. A ripple of laughter followed, one of the engineers rolling his eyes. "We checked that a dozen times," he said, his voice edged with impatience. Deshawn didn't argue. He simply tightened the connector, then moved on. Next, he traced a series of circuits with his hand, pausing at a junction where the wires bent at an odd angle. His brow furrowed. "Misaligned," he whispered, adjusting it back into place. Again, snickers erupted behind him. To them, these were simple observations, insults to their degrees. To him, they were the whispers of a machine desperate to be heard. As he worked, he spoke softly, almost as if teaching. "Engines don't lie," he said, his voice calm. "They'll tell you what's wrong, if you stop trying to force them into what you want and just listen." The words cut deeper than he intended, landing squarely on the pride of the room. Vanessa's pen froze mid-tap. The engineers stiffened, their smiles faltering for just a breath. His philosophy wasn't wrapped in formulas or jargon, but in something older and far more uncomfortable. Humility. Then came the discovery that silenced even the whispers. Deshawn leaned closer to the base of the engine, his flashlight catching a faint hairline fracture on one of the panels. He tapped it gently with the back of his wrench, listening to the dull echo. "There," he said quietly. "A crack. Barely visible, but it's leaking pressure every time the system cycles." The room stilled. None of the engineers spoke. Weeks of testing, data, and simulations, and not one of them had noticed the tiny flaw. Deshawn straightened, wiped his hands on a rag, and added, "Doesn't matter how perfect the math looks. If the foundation's cracked, the whole system fails." For the first time, Vanessa's mask slipped. Her smirk faded as she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, not in mockery but in reluctant interest. She remembered her father's words again, about patience, about listening, and it unsettled her that this man, standing in dusty boots, echoed lessons she had buried under years of ambition. Still, she clung to her pride. "Fixing it is another matter," she said, her voice tight. Deshawn only nodded. "That's the easy part." With careful precision, he reinforced the damaged panel, realigned the wires, and secured every connector with a practiced hand. The room fell into complete silence now, the earlier laughter evaporating into a tense anticipation. Vanessa's gaze never left him, her arms slowly uncrossing, her smirk long gone. The engineers who had mocked him now leaned forward, eyes narrowing, their arrogance replaced by something they hadn't expected to feel: uncertainty. Finally, Deshawn stepped back. He wiped the sweat from his brow, placed his wrench neatly into the toolbox, and without ceremony said, "Try it now." For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the engineers hesitated forward, pressing the ignition sequence. The boardroom seemed to hold its breath. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life with a deep, steady hum. The sound reverberated through the room, powerful and alive, filling the silence with undeniable proof. Gasps broke the stillness. A few hands flew to mouths, eyes widened, and disbelief rippled like a shockwave across the table. The machine that had mocked their genius now purred obediently under the touch of a man they had ridiculed. The shame was visible. Engineers exchanged stunned glances. Their earlier laughter now knives turned inward. Pride crumbled, replaced by something raw. Respect, grudging but undeniable. Vanessa sat frozen, her nails pressed into the armrest, her mind whirring faster than the engine. For the first time in years, her certainty cracked. She had taunted him, staged his failure, but the result had stripped away her armor more effectively than any insult could. The mask of arrogance slipped, revealing something rare in her: vulnerability. Deshawn stood quietly, not basking in the triumph, not demanding recognition. He simply folded his arms and watched the machine run, the steady rhythm of its success, echoing his philosophy. It wasn't about pride, it was about listening, respecting the small details, the hidden truths. And in that moment, the balance of the room shifted. The man they had dismissed had become the teacher, and the empire that mocked him was now learning the language of humility. The steady hum of the engine filled the boardroom like a heartbeat restored after a long silence. No one laughed now. The arrogance that had thickened the air only an hour earlier had vanished, replaced by awe and a weight that none of them could shake. The engineers who had mocked Deshawn sat forward in their chairs, their eyes searching for an explanation that their textbooks had never given them. One finally broke the silence, his voice uncertain but honest. How did you see that crack? We ran diagnostics for weeks, and nothing showed." Deshawn glanced at him, his tone even and free of triumph. "Machines don't hide their truth. You just have to respect them enough to notice. Patience is the difference between noise and a voice. If you're too proud, you'll never hear it." His words settled over the room, not like an accusation, but like a quiet lesson meant for anyone willing to listen. Another engineer leaned in, almost defensive. "But the math, the data, never—" Deshawn interrupted gently, not with rudeness but with certainty. "Math is perfect. Machines are not. They live in the real world, where tiny cracks and loose wires undo entire systems. You can't always calculate respect. You just have to practice it." The young man sat back, chastened, his pride softening. Into understanding. Around the table, heads nodded slowly. These were people used to believing they were the smartest in any room, yet they now felt like students in front of a teacher who hadn't come to boast but to show them how blind their arrogance had made them. Vanessa, for once, had no sharp retort ready. She stared at the engine, the roar echoing through her like a truth she didn't want to face. Her entire career had been built on never admitting weakness, never allowing humility to dent her armor. But watching Deshawn, hearing his quiet explanations, she felt the weight of her own underestimation pressing down like never before. Her voice, when it came, lacked the edge it usually carried. "I misjudged you," she said softly, almost as if the admission tasted foreign on her tongue. "I thought you didn't belong here. But it seems I was the one who didn't belong, in my own assumptions." Deshawn looked at her, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Sometimes the hardest engines to fix aren't the ones on the table," he said. The words struck deeper than the sound of the machine itself. Vanessa blinked, caught off guard by how precisely they landed, as if he had reached past her pride and touched the raw truth beneath. For years, she had thought of herself as unbreakable, but in that moment, she realized the cracks she carried were no less real than the one he had found on the prototype. Pride had made her blind to patience, ambition had deafened her to respect, and in her hunger for power, she had forgotten the lessons her father once tried to teach her. The engineers shifted uncomfortably, each one reflecting in silence. They had mocked, laughed, dismissed, yet now they sat humbled by a man who had never asked for recognition. One of them finally spoke, his tone sincere. "We've been so focused on proving ourselves right, we forgot to actually listen." "Thank you." Deshawn gave only a small nod. He didn't need their gratitude. The lesson wasn't for him. It was for them to carry forward. Later, when the board reconvened without Deshawn, Vanessa surprised them all. She spoke not with her usual icy dominance, but with measured honesty. She admitted her mistake in doubting him, acknowledged the arrogance that had blinded their team, and reminded them that solutions sometimes come from the most unexpected places. Her words weren't polished for effect. They were raw, genuine, and for the first time her engineers looked at her not just as a ruler, but as a leader willing to grow. The memory of that day lingered in Helix dynamics far longer than the roar of the repaired engine. It became a quiet turning point, a reminder whispered in hallways and repeated in workshops, that greatness doesn't always arrive wearing a suit or holding a degree. Sometimes it arrives in dusty boots and calloused hands, carrying lessons, forged in silence and humility. And as the story closed, one truth remained clear. Respect the overlooked, for they may be the ones who save you when all else fails. Pride builds walls, but humility builds bridges, and in the end, it is the bridge builders who change the course of history